Hello. First, I'd like to say welcome. It's awesome to see a great crowd. My name is John Tittle. I'm the student co-chair of the Committee on Lectures at Iowa State. And before we get started with the speech, I'd like to say thank you to the Sociology Department and the Psychology Department for bringing in Dr. Scheck. And I would also like to tell you of two notable events coming up in the future that you should put on your calendar for sure. This Wednesday we have a panel of notable African women, and they're going to speak on global justice and human rights, and that's here in the Sunroom at 8 p.m., so right here in 2 days. And then we also have a speech entitled God After Darwin. John Hott, a professor at Georgetown, will be speaking, and that is the 16th of October at 3 p.m. In the Sunroom. So, and also there's some refreshments back there, but since we have about 700 people, I don't know. I don't know how much time you'll have to get those refreshments. But after the speech, please feel free, and please use the microphone as well when you're addressing questions to Barry Scheck. Okay, thank you. And Dr. Wells, please, if you introduce Dr. Scheck. Thanks.
Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Gary Wells. I'm a professor in the Psychology Department, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Barry Scheck got his law degree at Berkeley in 1974, and he's been a professor of law at Cardozo Law School for, 24, 25 years, maybe longer, huh, Barry? 28 years. And Cardozo is affiliated with Yeshiva University in New York City. And Barry Scheck, along with Peter Neufeld, founded the Innocence Project in New York. Now, the Innocence Project started as really just a name that Barry and Peter gave to the files, to the pile of files and of letters that they had received from inmates who were proclaiming their innocence. And bringing together then a network of people and institutions who were prepared to dedicate their time and their effort, Scheck and Neufeld began to litigate claims of innocence with the new tool that forensic DNA had presented. Forensic DNA, a 1990s phenomenon. And in 1992, the Innocence Project was founded. Tirelessly, methodically, and with prescience, they wove a network of cases across the country into an increasingly convincing and coherent national picture of convictions of the innocent, a picture that is still unfolding to this day, and you'll hear about the most recent one from just a few days ago. And today, there are innocence projects that Barry and Peter have spun off to other localities across the country, and these exist now in almost every state. There are over 160, Barry tells me as of today, there are 165 definitive DNA exoneration cases on the Innocence Project website, all of whom have been freed from prison, some of whom had been on death row, and this number continues to grow. But Barry is not at all satisfied, has never been satisfied with simply freeing these innocent people. For one thing, these were the lucky ones. What about all the cases where DNA evidence was never collected, or where it was lost, or where it was destroyed, which is the most common outcome when they begin trying to investigate these cases? Those are frequent. You can't help those people. Even larger, what about the thousands and thousands who were convicted on the same types of evidence, such as eyewitness accounts or jailhouse snitches, for which there was no DNA evidence? Cases having DNA evidence represent a small fraction of the cases. What do we do about the other 95% or so? But these DNA exoneration cases, the lucky ones, for whom there was preserved biologically rich trace evidence to prove their innocence, represent a well-documented and definitive set of cases that we're going to be studying for many, many years to come. Never in the history of the legal system has there been such a rich and large set of cases for studying the causes of wrongful conviction. Now, had Barry stopped, I think, a few years ago and rested on his laurels and confined himself to his status as a law professor, he would still be a legend in the annals of criminal justice for perhaps a millennium. But fortunately for all of us, Barry does not rest. He continues to facilitate exonerations of innocent people and has now taken up the cause of legal reform. What have we learned from these convictions of innocent people? What are the flaws in our evidentiary system that can lead a jury to find an innocent person guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? A great deal of Barry's time is now spent trying to effect a select number of reforms to help prevent innocent people from being convicted in the future. Now, I've known Barry for many years now. Our paths crossed a number of years ago, early in the unfolding of the DNA exoneration cases, because Barry recognized early on, very quickly, that most of these cases that were being uncovered involved mistaken identification testimony. So we've worked together on many levels, and he's been an important ally in my efforts to bring about reform in the collection and use of eyewitness identification evidence. A little more about Barry. Barry is a true celebrity. You know you're a celebrity when Time Magazine's People section makes a note of you getting a parking ticket in Manhattan, as if that were news. Well, for celebrities, anything they do seems to be news. There's no talk show that he's not been on. Well, Jerry Springer's not a talk show, is it? So I think there's no talk show that he's not been on. You haven't been on Springer, have you? Okay, all right, just checking. No major newspaper or magazine has failed to cover Barry and his work. Yes, he is a celebrity, in part because of his work on the O.J. Simpson case, the British Nanny case, and other high-profile cases. But the real story of Barry's greatness is the Innocence Project and his focused efforts to create legal reform based on weaknesses unveiled through DNA exoneration cases. Now, I've had the experience more than once to stroll around Manhattan with Barry as we discuss various issues, and it's among the most surreal experiences of my life. Because when I'm alone on the streets of Manhattan, where thousands of people are scurrying around it, it seems socially cold and unfriendly, at least from an Iowan's perspective. But when I stroll with Barry, you can't go more than 30 or 40 paces without hearing, "Hey, Barry! Barry!" People love him there. They know him. They love him. These are black people, white people, Hispanic. They're cops, mothers, businessmen, people in three-piece suits, and street people. Suddenly, these streets then, and this is the surreal part of it, feel like, when I'm walking with Barry, an old movie set of It's a Wonderful Life in a small Midwest town. But this is New York City, the antithesis of a small town. In other cities, at other times, I've seen Barry hugged by mothers of innocent men finally freed from prison. And it's at times like this that I realize that this is perhaps the fuel that keeps Barry going. So please give a welcome hand to my friend, Barry Scheck.
Well, it's absolutely fantastic to be here and be so generously and warmly introduced by Gary, who I was telling people at Drake University Law School today, you know, until sometimes when you're within a university or academic setting and you know somebody well, and you just know them from playing golf or playing pool or going over to the office and bouncing ideas, taking classes, you don't realize the magnitude of this individual's influence. Gary Wells is not only a distinguished psychologist who among his peers has legendary status, but he invented essentially all the meaningful research in the last 2 decades in the area of eyewitness identification. And it is Gary's charge to Peter Neufeld, myself, and all the academics and lawyers in the Innocence Projects across the country to reform this area. And I'm going to talk a lot about that tonight, exactly what we're doing and how we're doing it. But it is Gary's example. It is his work, his dedication to this cause, that really has charted this path. And it's really been quite extraordinary, because we met many, many years ago when I was, I had been a public defender and I had done all these eyewitness cases. And then I'll never forget the first time I heard him talk. It was such a revelation. But you had the pipe. You don't use the pipe anymore. You don't have the pipe. Gary told you a little bit about New York. So maybe I'll just start with the New York story, because it's you can read about it in today's New York Times. Life is much stranger than fiction. As Gary mentioned, and I'll discuss in a minute, at our Innocence Project, maybe at least we could hit the first slide. As Gary mentioned, we've had 165 post-conviction DNA exonerations. And the way it works at our project, very simply, is that inmates write us letters. I must get 300 letters a week. We now have a not insubstantial number of people on staff who look at these letters, read them, try to get transcripts. We have to go back in cases that are 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30 years old, try to find the transcripts is a struggle, just so that we can find out if there is any piece of biology, a blood stain, a semen stain, hairs with roots, skin cells on clothing, let's say saliva on a mask that was left at a crime scene by a perpetrator, something that is biology we can test with DNA in order to determine identity and to figure out whether somebody is innocent or guilty. That's what we're all about. And as Gary mentioned, 75% of the time, even when we find a case where DNA would make a difference, the evidence is lost or destroyed. And we do everything we can to search for it, but it's lost or destroyed. And that leads me to one case that we have that just broke in New York City that is stranger than fiction. We have a client named Barry Gibbs. And Barry Gibbs was convicted of murder in Brooklyn. It was alleged, it's a fact, that one day, in fact, November 4th, 1986, on the Belt Parkway, which is this ring road around Brooklyn, near the riding stables, a man was seen getting out of an automobile, and there was a body wrapped in a blanket, and he threw this body off to the side of the road. There was a man jogging by named Perry Mitchell, a man with a criminal record and a drug history, but was 300 feet away, happened to see it, and there was a ranger from the park police. The assailant drove off. They went, opened the blanket. My God, there's this African-American woman who's dead. And they go get the jogger, and the park ranger and this jogger agreed that the individual they saw had sort of gray hair, Caucasian male, 5'6", 140 pounds. And so an investigation begins. All of a sudden, the first responding officer is taken off the case, and an individual, a detective named Ippolito, jumps in, parachutes in, and steals the case away. And then Ippolito, over the next few days, begins to look in the local neighborhood in Brooklyn where this crime occurred, or nearby, for a white male, any white male, that had known this African-American woman who actually made a living by engaging in acts of prostitution. And soon he found Barry Gibbs, who was a former postal employee who had been seen with this woman on a prior occasion. Gibbs had no criminal record. He had once a misdemeanor trespass. And in fact had seen this woman and not had a sexual favor with her, but actually had knew her, spoken to her, and had been observed. The next thing he knows, he's brought down to the police precinct. He's worked over pretty good by this cop. The jogger is brought in. We suspect, cannot prove, although it's believed that the jogger saw him before a lineup was conducted. The jogger identifies Gibbs as the perpetrator. He's brought to trial. Really no more evidence than that, and he's convicted. He starts in 1992 when DNA technology, when our Innocence Project first started, and people first heard about us getting individuals out with post-conviction DNA tests. He starts writing. Finally, by 1997, we're able to gather his transcripts together. 1999, we're working on his case, and we start looking for the evidence, and we cannot find it. We're looking for fingernail scrapings from the victim, where you could do a DNA test from the material under the fingernails, put it into a DNA data bank, maybe get a hit on that. We were looking for hairs that might have been left at the scene by the assailant in the blanket. We were looking for the evidence. The evidence had disappeared. Nobody could find it. The last person that seemed to have had it was Detective Ippolito. Now, there's a movie called Double Indemnity. Have any of you ever, who here has ever seen the movie Double Indemnity? Well, here's the best part of my lecture, because you should go out and rent Double Indemnity. This is one of the greatest film noirs in the history of American cinema. It was directed by Billy Wilder, stars Fred MacMurray, Barbara Stanwyck, and Edward G. Robinson. The screenplay was written by William Faulkner and Raymond Chandler, based on a novel by James Cain. This is an extraordinary movie, and I give away nothing by telling you that there's a character in the movie played by Edward G. Robinson who is an insurance adjuster. And this insurance adjuster always talks about how inside him there is a little man. And the little man always talks to him anytime he reviews a case and there's something wrong with it. So my little man always told me that there was something wrong with the Barry Gibbs case, that the testimony of this jogger seemed, as the British would say, stitched up to me. The staff attorney who worked with me on this case, Vanessa Potkin, her little woman was telling her that there was something wrong too. When we would talk to Barry on the phone, we believed him. We noticed that the witness all of a sudden is starting to testify that Barry's the guy, and he's about 6 feet tall, and he's a big, heavy-set guy even then. It doesn't seem to really meet this description, yet this guy's identifying him, yet he is convicted, yet he is sentenced to life. So we cannot close the case. We can't bring ourselves to close the case because we have to move on. We have lots of people asking us to help them, and ordinarily, if we can't find the evidence, we just close it out. We couldn't stop taking Barry Gibbs's telephone calls from prison. We couldn't tell him we were giving up. About 5 months ago, in New York City, in the Eastern District of New York Federal Court, an indictment is announced. It's a fairly extraordinary one. The indictment charges Detective Louis Ippolito and another detective named Carapana, and they say, starting in 1986, at around the time of this incident, this crime, Detective Ippolito and Detective Carapana started working for an employer other than just the New York City Police Department. Began working for organized crime. They were doing favors for them. They were doing hits. And when they did some of these hits, they were disposing of bodies off the Belt Parkway in New York. Not that we're suggesting for a minute that Ippolito or Carapana actually was the man who tossed this body over, but here is Ippolito coming to take this case. It was always suspicious to us that the evidence search stopped with Ippolito, who seemed to be the last person that had access to this evidence, and we couldn't find it. So we called the United States Attorney's Office in the Eastern District, the Brooklyn District Attorney, who I've known for years, and called them on the phone and said, listen, we don't like this case. We'd like you to investigate it. We don't want to go find that jogger ourselves. We want you to find them. We want you to investigate it. You must know much more about this than we do, because here's what we see as the problems in the evidence, the things we think are suspicious. So sure enough, last week, literally I think a week ago Monday, we received a telephone call from the prosecutors and others in a series of communications. We learned that the detectives themselves from the Drug Enforcement Administration had investigated this matter and had reached the same conclusion we had, that Barry Gibbs was framed, that they had spoken to the eyewitness who said that he had been pressured to identify Gibbs, that at the time he identified him in a lineup, that the time that he identified him in court, He knew Gibbs was not the person who committed the crime. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office agreed to vacate the conviction, and Barry Gibbs walked out of prison, I guess last Wednesday of last week, a free man. First thing he did is he went to my apartment in Brooklyn and took a bath for 2.5 hours, along with all the agents, which was really particular. Can anybody make up a story like that? I mean, rogue cops working for organized crime, framing an innocent guy, inducing him a wrongful identification. It's still terrifying. It's still the most bizarre and unbelievable case in the series of unbelievable cases. And if any of you are wondering what happens to people when they are let out of prison after being wrongfully convicted, I commend your attention to this article today by Joyce Pernick in the New York Times. It's entitled, 19 Years Late, Freedom Has a Bitter Taste. Last week, after spending 19 years in prison for a murder he did not commit, Barry Gibbs was freed. "You're free," said the judge. "You're free," said the district attorney. "Great. But free to do what? And with what?" asks a man whose life was robbed. "I got nothing," Mr. Gibbs, 57, said 2 days later. Nothing. Mr. Gibbs, the authorities say, was framed by Louis J. Ippolito, a former detective now under indictment for doubling as a mob hitman. Mr. Gibbs does not know why he was the fall guy. He is baffled, and he is resentful. "I'm angry, disheartened, and confused," he said on Saturday in his lawyer's office on Lower Fifth Avenue. He moved around the room nervously, finally settling into a chair with an unobstructed view of the door. He has diabetes and asthma, and at least 50 pounds more than when he went behind bars. Prison food. High carbohydrates. None of you are on the Atkins diet. None of you really see that as a problem. Okay. Here is what he does not have. He does not have his old job as a letter carrier. He does not have his ex-wife, who died several years ago. He does not have his mother, who died last year. He does not quite have his father, suffering from dementia at a home in New Mexico. He does not quite have his son, now 34. There is friction. He does not have money, and will have no Social Security benefits because he paid into the postal system's retirement program instead and says it went to his son's college education. His imprisonment threw him his veteran benefits into limbo. He was actually a Vietnam vet. He has no place to live, no place to observe the high holy days, no sense of place, period. Quote, "I hear you can't put money in a turnstile to get into a train. And no, this blunt Brooklynite does not have any forgiveness in him. They threw me in a cage. Why is it you can take my life away and after 19 years they leave me with nothing? The government that unjustly imprisoned him has given him no help, nor is it obligated to. Most people in this situation get less than people who committed crimes," said me, who works on the Innocence Project. There is sort of a black hole for those that are innocent. Jeremy Travis, president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, said that ex-convicts on parole at least got some guidance and some services. Do states have the same obligation for those who are exonerated as they have for everybody else, asked Mr. Travis, author of But They All Come Back, a book about released prisoners? I think the answer is yes. But the exonerated number only about 50 a year, and their plight is nowhere near a national priority. Mr. Gibbs can sue the state for wrongful conviction and can pursue a federal civil rights case, but lawsuits take time, even when the injustice is as blatant as this case. "It's never automatic," said Michelle Hirschman, first Deputy Attorney General in New York. "We're dealing with taxpayer money. We always insist the plaintiff meets the burdens." For now, Mr. Gibbs is getting help from his lawyers and from an old friend. Somebody said maybe they could find me a room in a shelter, said Mr. Gibbs, who is temporarily in a hotel. "A shelter. I'd rather live on the subway or on the streets." He is living an unremarkable life 19 years ago, neither that of a reprobate or of a model citizen. He had a drug problem, once fought with his girlfriend, picked up a prostitute one night to spite her. Didn't work out. "Don't worry," he said. Seems his girlfriend interrupted the proceedings. When that same prostitute was later murdered, detectives discovered Mr. Gibbs had been a client and arrested him. He was convicted on the testimony of a witness who now says, to denials from Mr. Ippolito's lawyer, that he was coerced. And Mr. Ippolito and an ex parte are indicted in March. Mr. Gibbs' lawyer contacted the authorities, as I told you. Well, he got out of prison, but it might be overstating to say that he's free. So that was my week. And as Gary and Lisa can tell you, since then, all I've been trying to do is find out a way to get this guy a place to live on Wednesday. When we finally get a case at the Innocence Project where DNA can prove innocence and we send it to the laboratory, 40% of the time, the results come back in favor of the inmate, which is quite extraordinary. 60% of the time, we find out that the people are guilty. Now, wait a second. 40% of the time, people who have lost their trials, lost their appeals, lost their post-conviction proceedings, lost their federal writs of habeas corpus, hundreds of judges have said guilty, 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 and you're telling me 40% of those cases that people come back with results that are favorable to them? That is telling us something pretty interesting. The FBI itself has been doing DNA testing since 1989, and they're the only one that really keeps track of the numbers. At first, only the FBI would be doing this testing as a public laboratory. There were some private labs, but there were no state and local labs. And what our friend Dwight Adams, head of the scientific division of the FBI, told me just a few weeks ago, confirmed they keep this number, that in 26% of the cases where law enforcement sends them information on people who have invariably been indicted or arrested, that's proof of probable cause to arrest, when they do the DNA tests, they find out in 26% of the cases the primary suspect is excluded. And that is a conservative number because if there were 4 suspects in a case, and they're all excluded, they just count it as one case. Now, I am not telling you that 26% of people in American prisons are innocent. That's not true at all. We're talking here about people who hopefully would have been acquitted or their cases dismissed anyhow. But here they're arrested and indicted, and before the trial, DNA excludes them. Indeed, we may have 165 post-conviction DNA exonerations, but, and you can look them all up yourself. Please, I urge you to do so. Go to innocenceproject.org. You can read about every case. But the fact of the matter is, there have been tens of thousands of people in the last decade who have been arrested or indicted, and then DNA testing has been done, and they find out it was a mistaken ID, a false confession, bad crime lab work, a perjurious witness, maybe a cop doing a bad thing. Something like that has led to a wrongful arrest. And that is the subterranean movement, which I think has caught the attention of judges, prosecutors, police, certainly the defense bar, and citizens across this country, because there is something that has happened in every jurisdiction just like that, and people are beginning to pay attention about what's wrong with this system and what we can do to fix it. In 47% of our cases, we have been able to identify the person who really committed the crime. In 14 of our cases, individuals had been sentenced to death and then were subsequently exonerated with DNA testing. Indeed, since the reinstitution of the death penalty in 1974, the Death Penalty Information Center keeps track, and I think they're up to something like 118 cases where people were convicted, sentenced to death row, and then some new evidence of innocence led to their convictions being vacated. Now, you will find that some of my colleagues in the prosecutor's offices will dispute that number from the Death Penalty Information Center, and they'll say it's not 118, it's 70, it's 80, whatever they want to say. But you don't find them disputing the 165 post-conviction DNA exonerations. Again, these are individuals where their convictions were vacated, indictments dismissed based on DNA. Many times we find the real assailant. Often they are pardoned by governors on the grounds of innocence. A number of them have won judgments saying that they're innocent by clear and convincing evidence and recovered damages in court, some number of them. So read about them yourselves, and you decide whether these cases are instances of people wrongfully convicted. Well, we are in a race against time to find all this evidence because we know that the evidence is being destroyed. But let me be the first to tell you, and Gary has already mentioned that DNA is not a panacea for what ails the criminal justice system. Really, because most cases, there is no biology that we can test. So what these cases represent is a learning moment, is an opportunity to understand what's wrong with the system. Because Just the arrow, I think that'll do it. The most important thing to realize about each of these reforms that we're working on to improve the criminal justice system is that they're just good law enforcement. The truth of the matter is, every time an innocent person is arrested, indicted, convicted, or God forbid, sentenced to death or executed, the real perpetrator is out there committing more crimes. That is the truth. So if we can get to the heart of what causes wrongful convictions, we don't just protect the innocent, but we enhance the capability of law enforcement to catch the people who are really guilty, who are committing crimes before they do more. So what are the causes of wrongful convictions? And this is more than just based on the first 74 cases. Mistaken eyewitness identification is the single greatest cause of the conviction of the innocent. That's why the work of Professor Wells is of such profound importance to our system. False confessions or admissions. Here I'm talking about people that either confess to crimes that they didn't commit after being coerced into it, or instances where people make admissions statements. Police say, he knew it was a green sock and nobody would know except the real perpetrator, and then the defendant says, I never said that, he's making it up, or she's making it up. Junk or fraudulent forensic science. Unfortunately, and I'm going to talk at some length about this tonight, talk primarily about eyewitness identification and forensic science. There are a number of forensic assays that are not adequately validated, and we have a real problem with quality assurance in our crime labs and really making it the kind of professional, rigorous scientific discipline that it should be. It is not CSI, I assure you. Police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, usually the suppression of exculpatory evidence, jailhouse snitch testimony, and maybe the most important problem of all, and that is bad lawyers. The standard, this is way understated to say 32%, because unfortunately in our court system, the test for whether or not a lawyer has been ineffective is you put a mirror under the nose of the lawyer, and if it fogs up, then you have an effective lawyer according to the courts. 41 years ago, in the Gideon decision, the United States Supreme Court said people charged with felonies in this country have a right to an attorney if they can't afford one. But if you go throughout this nation, you will see that court-appointed lawyers, public defenders' offices, simply are not funded at the same level of pay as district attorneys' offices. They do not have access to resources. They do not get experts. And in capital matters, it's shocking, but even the president said in his State of the Union address, he recognizes that we have a serious crisis there in terms of people being charged in death penalty cases, getting adequate resources to put on a defense. And when the defense function breaks down, and when you do not have an adversary system, when the guilty are not getting vigorous representation, that's when police who cross the line like Eppolito can get away with it in case after case. That's when the charlatan people in crime labs who aren't even doing the tests, dry labbing it, or using invalid methodologies are not ever challenged. That's when prosecutors who cross the line or perjurious witnesses are allowed to get away with it. And they won't do it just in the case of individuals who are guilty. They'll cut all those same corners in the cases of people who are innocent, which not just leads to the conviction of the innocent, but allows real criminals who are committing serious crimes, serial rapists, serial murderers, to go free. There is a genius to our adversary system, and we have to respect it. And when the defense function is neglected, it does implode and fall in upon itself. So we have a reform agenda, and we are led by Gary in trying to reform eyewitness identification, because there are things, and I'll discuss them, that can reduce incorrect identifications without reducing correct identifications, and they must be done. What about false confessions? Why not videotape them? That's a reform that we're pushing and succeeding at in many jurisdictions. Just videotape the interrogation. That allows judges and lawyers later to see whether there was any coercion, whether or not there was a false admission, because you can't cheat on that videotape. It protects police against false accusations that they coerced confessions or lying about what was said, and it actually is good training and helps catch criminals. It is a best practice, a win-win reform. We need statutes. We now have them in 34 states. When we started the work of the Innocence Project, in most jurisdictions we couldn't get access to the evidence because they said the statute of limitations had run. We had a 21-day rule in Virginia. 21 days after the trial, you couldn't put on new evidence of innocence to get a conviction reversed. So we've been doing that. We need crime lab oversight, accreditation of laboratories. We need compensation for the wrongly convicted, like our friend Barry Gibbs. We need something I'll describe very quickly as innocence commissions. And this is something that the American Judicature Society, that is housed in Drake University Law School, has been helping us with for a number of years. Just think of this. When an airplane falls from the sky or a train derails in this country, what do? We bring in the National Transportation Safety Board, a small group of experts that speak truth to power. They're an independent agency. They can get any experts they want, and they just try to find out one thing. What went wrong and how can we fix it? And then they make their recommendations, which are sometimes ignored. But they try to find out what caused this disaster. Was it system error? Was it individual error? What went wrong? How can we fix it? Indeed, in any hospital or public institution where the life and liberty of citizens are at stake, isn't that what we need to do? But when our clients walk out of prison wrongly convicted after 10, 15, 20 years, there's not a reported decision. We do not collect that data. We do not systematically go back and look at these cases. So that's what we're calling for. They have such models in Canada. They call them commissions of public inquiry. And they have a government agency in Britain called the Criminal Case Review Commission that does it. And I know we now have an Innocence Commission in North Carolina, interestingly enough. We have one in Connecticut. We have the Conference of Chief Justices of State Courts recommending and calling for it. The American Judicature Society is helping with it. I think that this is a capstone reform that embraces all others that's coming. Now, the role of DNA exonerations in the case of eyewitness reform is very important. After a man named Cromedy was exonerated in New Jersey, after Ronald Cotton in North Carolina, a wonderful PBS special called What Jennifer Saw, if you ever get it, featuring the victim of that crime, a woman named Jennifer Thompson, and Ronald Cotton, a man who she wrongly identified, not once but in 2 different trials, and the real perpetrator was apprehended, and the 2 of them have become the best of friends and crusaders for eyewitness reform. In Massachusetts, we've had a number of cases, and all across the board, exonerations have led to reforms. Next slide. This is Tommy Doswell. Tommy Doswell, just this August, was exonerated in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'll only tell you about recent cases. And Tommy, it was interesting. Big guy, was a football player in high school. The prosecutor, who had actually objected to the testing for years and slowed this whole process down, when finally the DNA cleared him, came down to look at him. The prosecutor's a pretty big guy too. And Peter Neufeld looked at the prosecutor, looked at Tommy, and he said to the prosecutor, "Did you play football?" And it turned out that the 2 of them had been 2 years apart and were high school football stars in Pittsburgh. And here was poor Tommy. He had been once arrested on sexual assault charges. The charges were dismissed, but there was a police officer that believed that he might have gotten away with something. So when a rape was committed in the community, they created a photo array. And the photo array that they showed to the victim in this particular case was Tommy Doswell, other people, and under Tommy Doswell's photograph was the letter R. Now, you don't have to be Gary Wells to know that that is not a fair photo array. More amazingly, we found out from authorities in Pittsburgh that they do this all the time. That anytime they have a former rape suspect and they have his picture, they allowed it to be shown in a photo array with an R. It's astonishing. So Tommy just got out of prison in August. Next case. Here is my friend Luis Diaz. So just a week after Doswell got out, in the end of August, think about this case. 26 years ago in Coral Gables, Florida, there is a road that goes from Coral Gables into Miami known as Bird Road. And there were a series of sexual attacks on Bird Road. What would happen is that women would be driving alone in their cars. A man would pull up behind them and flash his lights. The women would pull over to the side of the road. Then the man would pull out a gun, he would point it to them, and he would say, "Get into my car." He would speak English. Some describe the perpetrator as speaking with a Latin accent. The women would get into the car. Sometimes he demanded oral sex. Sometimes it was vaginal sex. Sometimes the women got away. Altogether, over a 2-year period, there were 26 attacks on Bird, 23 attacks, on Bird Road. 23 attacks. One day, police, for some reason, and this is probably key to what happened, were not telling the public about these attacks. So there were these serial offenses going on, but it was really unknown to the public, which I think is a problem. Policing methods have changed since then. Nonetheless, about 2 years in to these attacks going on, a man named Luis Diaz, who was here working legally on a green card, married, had 2 sons and a daughter, worked as a short order cook in a famous steak place in the Cuban community in Miami, Versailles. He always smelled of onions at the end of the day, pulled into a gas station. When he pulls into a gas station to get gas, the woman who was behind the counter is looking at him and goes, "Oh my God, that's the car, that's the man who raped me." She was one of the Bird Road victims. So she immediately called the police, and they arrived at the scene, and they looked at Luis Diaz. Now, there was a problem. Luis Diaz is 5'3", 130 pounds. The person that was described as having committed this crime was at least 5'9", sometimes as tall as 6 foot tall, and weighed far more. Luis Diaz didn't speak English. Didn't speak English. But the Bird Road rapist talked pretty good English, even with a Latin accent, according to all the victims. They then checked out his alibi. He was with his children. And the police then told this victim, "We're not making an arrest. We think that it's just a mistake. He's not the guy." Well, the next thing that happened is that this particular woman, this victim, wound up somehow getting in contact with a woman who was also one of the Bird Road victims, who was a radio talk show host. And when that woman found out that somebody had been arrested and let go, she got upset about it. It got into the newspapers. And the next thing you know, Luis Diaz is picked up. His photos are being shown to the other 23 victims. And then they hold a big lineup one day where all 23 victims come in to look at him at this lineup. He has a lawyer. His lawyer is named Roy Black. Roy Black was the defense lawyer in the William Kennedy Smith case. You see him all the time on the Today Show. He had a short-lived television program, a knockoff of The Apprentice, that lasted 2 weeks, where he would say, "You're fired," or the verdict's in, "You're gone." To lawyers, it was not a very successful show. And he's a great lawyer. But it really affects, frankly, the prosecutors and others in the Miami area that Roy was a lawyer, Roy was at the lineup, Roy tried his case, and Roy lost his case. And if Roy's representing you and you lose, it's scary. What happened was all the victims came in. There probably was some suggestion in terms of the photo arrays that we don't quite have before that, but they did this lineup, and out of the 23 victims, 8 identified him. Although later we found out from some witnesses that recanted that they weren't even sure at the time, and they were saying, "Why do you want me to pick number 3? I think it's number 6." And then they were shown stuff again. But he goes to trial on the 8 charges. He's convicted of 7. He's sentenced to life many times over. Years later, we were lucky enough to get an opportunity to do some DNA testing in this case. We were only able to find one sample that was available in a rape kit from one of the cases he was originally convicted on. We then asked the prosecutors, who were terrifically cooperative about it, to look for samples from those other uncharged cases, because more witnesses didn't identify him than did identify him. We got a DNA result, and I think it was like incident number 6, a male DNA profile that did not match Luis Diaz, and then in probably incident 19 or something like that, we got a DNA result. 2 male profiles, they matched each other, and that was enough for the prosecutors to agree to vacate his conviction and dismiss the case. You see here in this picture to the left, the 2 other men besides me in that picture, those were his sons. He had 2 sons and a daughter. Jose, I guess your left, he was the alibi witness. He was 14 years old. So he had to live his whole life knowing not just that he was reputed among all of his friends in high school and in the community to be one of the sons of the Bird Road rapist, but he also knew his father was innocent. He knew his father was innocent. And so many of these 165 post-conviction DNA exonerations are stories like that, of wrecked families. The crime victims themselves, the murder victims themselves and their families, they are victims too when the system gets it wrong. Everybody suffers. It's really an effort to make it right. But this is one of those lucky cases where we could. Just to give you a sense of the dimension of the problems of eyewitness mistaken identification, among our cases, out of 123 wrongful identifications, in 88 of the cases, it was one mistaken eyewitness. In 23 of the cases, there were two mistaken eyewitnesses. In 7 of the cases, there were 3 mistaken eyewitnesses. In 3 of the cases, there were 4 mistaken eyewitnesses. In 1 of the cases, the previous record, there were 5 mistaken eyewitnesses. And that case involves an individual named Kirk Bloodsworth, who was a United States Marine with no criminal record. 5 individuals testified that they saw him running out of a wooded area in Baltimore County, Maryland, where an 11-year-old girl had been murdered and sexually assaulted. He was convicted, sentenced to death, then convicted a second time after his case was reversed on some grounds, and sentenced to life in prison. DNA testing eventually freed Kurt, but the prosecutor in Baltimore County, I personally wrote to her, asked her for 5 years in a row to do another round of DNA testing with a different kind of technology, the one we use for the DNA databank system, where we have convicted offender samples in the databank, and she refused. And finally, they did it after 5 years of requests. And sure enough, because they always said, well, we have to vacate his conviction and dismiss his case, but we really don't necessarily think he's innocent. We just don't have enough evidence to convict him. Well, sure enough, there was a databank hit. Kirk, rather large man, reddish hair. The hit came back to a man that also had reddish hair, somewhat resembled him, considerably shorter. But the scary thing was, for 5 months in the prison system, they shared a jail cell. Now, Kirk Bloodsworth's story you can get in a very, very compelling book called Bloodsworth, written with a man named Tim Junkin. It's just that. You can get it off Amazon. He's the kind of speaker you might want to bring here. He testified quite a number of times with us in front of Congress in support of legislation known as the Justice for All Act, or the Innocence Protection Act, which did pass last year. And that section of the bill that says states don't get money for improving some of their DNA testing unless they pass a post-conviction DNA statute, that bill is known as the Kirk Bloodsworth bill. And of course, we have Luis Diaz, mistakenly identified by 8 eyewitnesses. This is just a chart showing the problems of cross-racial identification. I have to show you another picture of Luis because he's such a sweet man. And now let me tell you what we can do about it. There are a series of reforms pioneered by Professor Wells that we can implement that will reduce mistakes without reducing correct identifications. One of them is very simple. It's what's known as blind administration of the photo arrays or the lineups. That very simply means blind or double blind, that the person who is conducting the photo array or the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is. So there's no possibility of, by body language or inadvertence or on purpose, indicating to the witness which one of the people should be identified. There's no possibility, after the identification is made, of the administrator going, hey, that's the guy, we had a lot of evidence on him, which is a post-identification taint problem, which creates real difficulties because it falsely inflates the witness's sense of certainty, the witness's belief that they had a good look, that they were paying a lot of attention, and leads to error. So if you blindly administer the photo array of the lineup, study after study after study shows, over time, you reduce error without reducing correct identifications. Another thing you can do, when the victim or the witness is shown a photo array or a lineup, they must be warned. The real assailant may not be in this photo array or lineup. Don't worry, if you make no identification, the investigation will continue. An admonition of that nature dramatically reduces mistakes without reducing correct identifications. Why? Probably because most people, when they go to see a photo array in a lineup, think that, hey, the police had a reason for bringing him here in the first place, right? So if you warn people, you shouldn't make that assumption. That reduces their tendency to guess or their inducement to make an identification of somebody they think looks like the real assailant. When you're picking the fillers or stand-ins in a lineup or a photo identification procedure, pick those people in accordance with the description originally given by the witnesses, not in terms of their resemblance to the suspect. That reduces mistakes without reducing correct IDs. Also, you should take a statement of certainty in the witness's own words at the time they make the identification. And of course, that's much improved if the administrator is blinded. And then a reform that dramatically reduces errors, although it does diminish to some degree correct identifications, is what's known as sequential blind. Professor Wells has very persuasively shown, as a number of subsequent experiments have as well, that when witnesses make a mistake in an identification procedure, their natural error is when they make a mistake is that they are picking a person in that photo array lineup who most resembles the real assailant. That is the natural error. And you can, in some fashion, guard against that error by, instead of putting everybody together at the same time, a contemporaneous showing, which invites, in a sense, a relative judgment of who most resembles the assailant on the part of the witness. If instead you show them one at a time in sequence, is this the person, is this the person, is this the person, then that is going to reduce error. There is some evidence that it reduces correct identifications, although there are some ways to guard against that, or at least to ameliorate that effect by allowing them to go through it a second time, although once you do that, that again brings up the problem of relative judgment. But these are a series of reforms that have been proposed by Professor Wells to jurisdictions across the country and have been adopted, and certainly many of these I don't think any rational person can argue with, because they plainly reduce mistakes without reducing correct identifications. So I see three roads to making this happen across the United States. The first is voluntary adoption by prosecutors and police. It was astonishing. In the state of New Jersey, after the Cromedy case, the Attorney General in New Jersey, who has unique powers, can tell every prosecutor and law enforcement officer, hey, I got a new idea, this is what you ought to do. Brought in Gary. Gary gave a talk to all the prosecutors and police in New Jersey, and they went, oh my God, this man makes complete sense. We're going to do all these things. And I guess it's now, 3 years? 4 years? 4 years they've been doing it in the state of New Jersey. They love it. They have been collecting data on it. The prosecutors and police go all across the country and proselytize for these reforms as something that will reduce mistakes without reducing correct IDs, that helps law enforcement catch the real bad guys while protecting the innocent. That's one way to do it. So what we try to do, one reason I'm here, having gotten up at 4:30 in the morning to take a plane here and I'll fly out tomorrow morning at 6:30, is because I've asked Gary to do this, to talk to police and law enforcement maybe 100 times in the last few years, and he always does it. So the least I could do is come here. So these lectures, these presentations by law enforcement to law enforcement is beginning to lead to voluntary adoption in a number of places. Second thing we can do is legislation. We can have pilot programs on these ID reforms, like they have in the state of Illinois, legislation pioneered by a United States Senator, then a state legislator named Barack Obama. And then finally, something that Gary and I and Peter and others are working on, that is, we believe that the entire ways that the courts are dealing with the vetting of eyewitness evidence is unconstitutional, and that there are ways to get judges to charge juries. We were recently successful in Connecticut just by filing an amicus brief and showing them the social science data, that juries should properly be instructed about these particular problems. If you don't give a warning, if you don't do it blindly, if you don't pick the fillers correctly, that increases the chance of error. Juries should be told that, because that's the truth, and that's what the science has proven. And if you don't get that kind of a charge, the cases should be reversed. And the whole way courts are evaluating this evidence we believe has to be changed, including the leading precedent the United States Supreme Court, Manson v. Braithwaite. So I think this is really working. I think that there's a certain synergy here, because when you do all these things together and you have law enforcement agreeing, as they have for many years, about these best practices, it's more likely other jurisdictions will follow. It's more likely other legislatures will act. It's more likely that jurors are going to get impressed by the fact that, oh, wait, you're telling me Minnesota, New Jersey, North Carolina, all these states are doing it, and the science shows it, and you guys didn't do it in this case? That is going to make, and then finally, it's more likely courts will act. I think we're reaching critical mass. We have success in New Jersey, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Santa Clara, California. We have partial successes in Virginia, Louisiana. Hey, these are red states and blue states. I don't know what's going on in Iowa, Gary. I've never even asked you.
We're making progress.
Making progress in Iowa. Okay. So I think this is going to sweep the country. The next thing I'll talk to you about at some length, and then I'll take your questions, is crime lab reform. Crime labs ought to be an independent third force in the criminal justice system. We have forensic assays like bite marks, which are not validated even within the forensic community, where they can't prove they can get it right. Junk science. Handwriting has serious problems. Certain forms of arson investigation and observations that have been employed for years have now been discredited by better science, but the old convictions remain, and some people have been executed based on that evidence. And even fingerprints, which can be a reliable identifier, but there are very serious problems with what we would call the forensically significant question. Fingerprints, it's believed, are formed when the unborn child is in the amniotic sac and the fingers are rubbing against that sac, and friction will cause ridges and whorls and swirls. And so even identical twins who have the same DNA may have different fingerprints, right? But that doesn't tell you, when there is a latent fingerprint or a partial left at the crime scene, how many ridges and whorls and swirls, how many points of comparison can cause somebody to say, aha, this thumbprint comes from that person, where I have a complete thumbprint. Or how many points of dissimilarity does it take to say it's an exclusion? All across the world, literally, for years now, there have been different standards. Some countries require 30, 16, 12, 6, 8. The FBI took the position, we don't need a number. We look at the totality of the circumstances. We know it when we see it. I'm not kidding. And so there are all these different standards, and people just assume, oh, fingerprints, that's okay, that's easy, that can happen. A wonderful book for you to read that gives you the whole history of this. Suspect Identities by Simon Coles, C-O-L-E-S, from the University of California at Irvine. He's written a lot on this subject. It's a wonderful book, a great science history. So what we need in crime labs are some of these forensic assays have to be examined and validated properly scientifically. We need good quality assurances. The labs have to be accredited. We need proficiency tests where labs get things from outside. They get cases, mock cases, and we see if they can get it right. And we need independent oversight. Any time that a crime lab engages in an act of misconduct or serious negligence, and you catch somebody doing that, what ought to happen is what we do in every other kind of institution. We do a forensic audit. That is to say, you go back and you look at every case that person performed, or a random audit of other related cases. If there's misconduct or serious negligence. And this past session of Congress, we got Section 311 of the Justice for All Act, which says that if you want money on the Paul Coverdale Laboratory Improvement Act, which is yet to be funded, but if states or localities want it, they have to have an independent entity that can conduct such an audit whenever there's misconduct or serious negligence. Next one. So let me tell you a bit about Texas. Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas has a crime lab. At that Houston, Texas crime lab, they used to do DNA testing. It was unaccredited. They had leaks in the roof. It got closed down. By everybody's admission, they were terrible. And they convicted a man, Josiah Sutton, who just the other day got compensation from the state of Texas on the grounds of innocence, because they screwed up his DNA test, and they said that he was one of two people in a sexual assault, and he wasn't. And they should have known it. And they've now had to go back and redo over 1,000 cases in Texas just to see if they could get that right. But that wasn't the real problem with the crime lab, because this crime lab only had recently begun doing DNA. What about 19, 20 years of serology, of hair comparisons, of ballistics? So let me tell you the story of our client, George Rodriguez. George Rodriguez came to be charged in this fashion. It was charged in this fashion. It was charged in this fashion. It was